Hello, this is Mrs. Brown. Today we're going to talk about midpoint. The midpoint is a point that divides a segment into two equal segments, and we call that congruent segments. So in this case, since M is the midpoint, AM is congruent to MB, and that little line indicates that these two measures are the same length. Okay, and what we know is AM has to equal MB, and that's really useful when we're solving some of these problems that we're going to be looking at. Okay, a segment bisector, sometimes you're asked to identify that. It can be a point, ray, line segment, or plane. It's just something that intersects a segment at the midpoint. So in this case, this would be a ray that intersects. This would be a line segment that intersects, and this would be a line that would intersect. So there's just some of the examples. Okay, so let's look at what we're going to be doing with some problems for midpoint. All right. First thing says identify the segment bisector. So then find AB. Well, the bisector is what goes through the midpoint. In this case, if we're looking, it has an endpoint at M, and then it has an arrow, which tells me this is a ray. And so my segment bisector is going to be ray MC. Remember, I could also have done MC with a ray like that. Either of those would be correct answers. Okay. Now, what do I know? I don't have any like regular old numbers. I only have these two expressions, but I know that this one has to equal this one because that's the definition of a midpoint. So since this equals this, I'm going to write an equation that says that. So 5x minus 13 equals 3x plus 1. And my strategy now would be to actually solve the equation, and I'll get what x is. I can substitute it back in, and then I can actually find these segments. Okay, so if I'm looking, I'm going to subtract 3x from both sides. Add 13, so 2x equals 14, so x has to equal 7. So now in order to find this length, I'm going to substitute in 5 times 7 minus 13 is 35 minus 13, which would be 22. I'm going to double check. I don't actually need the other one because I know they're going to be equal, but that tells me whether I did it correctly because they should come out equal. So 3 times 7 is 21 plus 2 is, plus 1 is 22. So they are equal. But what am I looking for? I'm looking for AB, which is the whole distance. So 22 times 2 or 22 plus 22 would be 44. So AB equals 44. So again, if I had these two pieces, since I know they have to be equal to each other, I set them equal to each other in an equation. I can solve for x, substitute it back in, and find my number. Okay, let's take a look at this question. It says M is the midpoint of CD. It tells me what CD is and CM, and I have to find MD. Okay, first rule of geometry, draw a picture when it doesn't have one so that you know what you're talking about. So I have a line segment that's CD. I do not have to have anything fancy. I'm just trying to make sure that I understand where everything is. M is the midpoint. That tells me this is equal to this. Okay, CD, which is the whole thing, is 4x plus 10. And CM, which is this much, is 3x minus 7. And I don't have any information about this one. So this is a different problem. Okay, in the last one, I had the two segments, and I could add them, make them equal to each other because I knew they were equal, and that then could figure out the whole thing from there. Now I have the whole thing in one segment, but I'm missing the other one. Well, this is where we stop and think for a minute. If this and this are equal, I don't really need another expression for it if I have the whole thing, because this would be double whatever this is. So in this case, this came out to 22, and this came out to 22, so 22 times 22 is 44. So whatever this is times 2 would equal this whole thing, and that's my equation. So since I only have one of the two segments, I'm going to say 2 times that segment equals the 4x plus 10. So double this equals the whole thing, since these two pieces have to be equal to each other. I'm going to start by distributing. Okay, and then solving my equation. I'm going to move 4x over here, so I get 2x minus 14 equals 10. I add 14, that's 24, so I get 2x equals 24, so x has to be 12. And what am I looking for? I'm not looking for the whole thing. I'm only looking for the segment, this segment, which is equal to here. So when I substitute in, I'm going to substitute it into here. So 3 times 12 minus 7. 3 times 12 is 36. Minus 7 would give me 29. So my missing value here, my MD, not the whole thing, is going to be 29. Okay, let's take a look at what happens when we have just numbers, like points on a coordinate grid. All right, so taking a look at this question, we have the midpoint formula. You could work with the formula, but really, if you understand what average is, it's just averaging the x coordinates and averaging the y coordinates. To me, it's easier to think of it this way, but some people are more comfortable with the formula, whatever works with you. Okay, so if I find the midpoint, so A and B are endpoints. So A is here, B is here. This is 7, -2, and this is 11, 5, and I'm looking for the midpoint. So what am I going to do? I'm going to average the x's. I'm going to average the y's. So averaging the x's means I'm going to add them together, divide by 2. So 7 plus 11 is 18, divided by 2 is 9. I'm going to do the same thing with the y's. -2 plus 5 is 3, and 3 divided by 2 is 1.5. So my midpoint for that segment is going to be at 9, 1.5. Again, sometimes you are going to end up with decimals when you're dealing with midpoint, and that's okay. So again, when I'm looking at that, -2 plus 5 is 3, divided by 2 is 1.5. All right, let's take a look at the next one. M is the midpoint of RS. M, it gives me S. So I've got RS, and I've got a midpoint. And this time it told me what M was, and it told me what S is. Now, there's two ways to do this. I could take this and set it as an equation and do something like for the x coordinate, x1 plus 7 divided by 2 equals 2, and solve it, and I would get what R is. Or I can reason through. So let me change colors for a moment. Let's say I have 2 and 7. Well, 7 minus 2 is 5, and between M and S and M and R, the x has to be the same distance because you're averaging them. So 5 less than 2 is -3. Okay. So again, because 7 minus 2, this has to be also a distance of 5. This would be at -3. If I look at the y coordinates, okay, the difference between -6 and -3 is 3. So when I take a look at, and I could have done it -6 minus -3, it doesn't matter. I'm basically looking at the absolute value. This is a difference of 3. Now, this was going down, so I need to go up. I need to go the opposite direction. So if I'm thinking about the vertical number line, if -6 is here, -3 is here, I have to go this direction. So I'm getting less negative. So I'm going to add 3, which would be 0. And so my point -30 is what R would be. If I look at this, I times by 2. I get x sub 1 plus 7 equals 4. I subtract 7, and I get x equals -3. The same thing I got from reasoning through it. If I did the same thing, I take my y1 plus, where are we? -6 divided by 2 equals -3, times by -2, y sub 1 plus -6 equals -6. And so when I go ahead and add 6 to both sides, I end up with y equals 0, which is also what I got from reasoning it through. So it's whatever you're more comfortable with. You can set it up as an equation and just solve it. Or if you're saying to yourself to go from 2 to 7, I have to add 5. So I'm going to do the opposite, which is subtracting 5. To go from -3 to -6, I subtract 3. So I'm going to do the opposite, which is add 3, and you can reason it out that way. Okay? I hope this helps and have a great day.